Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in all of history. A siege that didn't just topple a city. It brought a 1,000-year-old empire crashing down and completely redrew the map of the world.
Just think about that for a second. For 1,123 years, this city was the capital of the Roman Empire, the heir to Rome itself. It was this shining beacon of Christendom in the East, a fortress that had turned away Persians, Arabs, you name it. And then, it was gone. In just 53 days, less than 2 months. The walls were smashed, the emperor lay dead in the streets, and an entire era of history just ended. So the big question is, how? How does a city that stood for over a millennium just disappear so fast?
Well, to really get what happened, we need to look at the city itself and the two men whose fates were absolutely destined to collide at its legendary walls. This is a story about the world's greatest prize.
So on one side, you've got Sultan Mahomet II. And get this, he's only 21 years old. But he's brilliant, ruthless, speaks a bunch of languages, and he has this laser-focused, unstoppable ambition. And on the other side, Emperor Constantine XI. He's the leader of a dying empire, really just a ghost of its former self. But he is courageous, defiant, and he's guarding this legendary city with just a handful of soldiers. It's a classic David and Goliath, but with empires. All right, let's really dig into Muhammad's mindset here. Because for him, taking Constantinople wasn't just another military campaign. No, this was a deep, personal obsession. It was the thing he thought about when he woke up and the last thing on his mind before he slept. He might have talked about peace, but all he could think about was war.
There's this story where his prime minister, his vizier, offers him gold. And Muhammad's response is just perfect. He basically says, I ask for a present far more valuable, Constantinople. He didn't want treasure. He wanted the ultimate prize, the city of Caesar. And he was going to get it, no matter the cost.
But here's the thing. Mahomet knew that those legendary Theodosian walls had stopped every army for 1,000 years. 1,000 years. He couldn't just throw men at them. He needed something new, a game changer, a revolution in warfare.
In that revolution, it all came down to one stupendous cannon. He found this brilliant Hungarian engineer named Urban and basically gave him a blank check. Build me a weapon, he said, that can shatter walls that have stood since the time of the Romans. And what Urban built was an absolute monster. We're talking about a cannon that fired these colossal stone cannonballs, weighing over 600 pounds each. Just imagine that. Each shot was designed to just pulverize defenses that everyone thought were literally impenetrable.
And just getting this thing to the battlefield was an epic journey in itself. It wasn't just the cannon, it was a whole operation. It took a team of 60 oxen and hundreds of men 2 full months just to drag this single weapon 150 miles. The logistics were an absolute nightmare, but it shows you how determined he was.
Okay, so while Mahomet is building his superweapon, what's going on inside Constantinople? Well, the city was basically crumbling from within. And its biggest weakness, it wasn't its walls, it was its own people.
I mean, just look at the odds. The numbers are staggering. The emperor could only find about 7,000 men to defend the city. And outside the walls, an Ottoman army of over 250,000. You do the math. They were outnumbered more than 35 to 1. It's just impossible.
But you know what's worse than being outnumbered? Being divided. The emperor was desperate, so he asked the Catholic West for help. The price? Uniting the Orthodox and Catholic churches. And for many people inside the city, that was a total betrayal of their faith. This quote here from a top imperial minister says it all. I'd rather see the Sultan's turban in the city than the Pope's hat. Think about that. They hated their fellow Christians more than the army literally out their gates. The city was broken before the first shot was even fired.
So now we get to the siege itself. It kicks off on April 6, 1453. And for the next 53 days, it's just this incredible, brutal drama of courage, genius, and absolute despair. The Ottoman cannons start their relentless pounding, day in, day out. But the defenders, you have to give it to them, they fought back with everything they had, repairing the walls every single night. And then, a moment of hope. A small fleet of Christian ships actually breaks through the Ottoman blockade. It's a shocking victory, and for a moment, it looks like they might just have a chance. That naval victory was a huge embarrassment for Mahomet. The city's main harbor, the Golden Horn, was sealed off by this gigantic iron chain.
It was supposed to be impenetrable from the sea. But the Sultan, instead of getting mad, he got creative. He came up with one of the most brilliant and frankly insane plans in all of military history.
If you can't sail past the chain, why not just go over land? That was his idea. In a single night, his army built a road of greased wooden planks, and they hauled nearly 80 of their ships, 80, on rollers, up and over a hill, and relaunched them right into the protected harbor. Can you imagine being a defender, waking up that morning and seeing an entire enemy fleet that just appeared out of nowhere behind your main defenses? It must have been absolutely soul-crushing.
So now the city is completely surrounded, attacked from land and sea. The walls are battered into rubble. The defenders are exhausted. Mahomet knows this is the moment. He prepares for one final all-out assault on the morning of May 29th.
And the breaking point, the moment it all fell apart, came down to one man. During the chaos of that final attack, the commander of the defense, a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, was wounded. The sources say he was so horrified by the sight of his own blood that he just abandoned his post. He ran. And that single act of cowardice, or maybe just human fear, it was like a contagion. Morale shattered, the whole defense just collapsed.
Emperor Constantine saw it was over. He knew all was lost. So he tore off his royal insignia so he wouldn't be captured and paraded as a trophy. His reported last words are just heartbreaking. He cried out, "Cannot there be found a Christian to cut off my head?" before he charged into the wave of oncoming soldiers, choosing to die with his empire.
And with the emperor's death, it was over. The fighting stopped. After 53 brutal days, the city had fallen. The Roman Empire, an institution that had shaped the world for almost 1,500 years, was just gone.
But the fall of Constantinople wasn't just an ending. In so many ways, it was a new beginning. It cemented the Ottoman Empire as a global superpower and sent a shockwave of fear across all of Europe. The world was never going to be the same.
You know, when Muhammad the Conqueror finally walked through the great, now empty palace of the Byzantine emperors, he didn't celebrate. The story goes he was quiet, and he recited this line from a Persian poem: "The spider has wove his web in the imperial palace." It's this incredibly sober reflection on how even the mightiest empires eventually fade to dust.
The fall of the city was a brutal, world-changing event, but it also arguably helped kickstart the Renaissance as Greek scholars fled west, carrying with them ancient knowledge that had been lost. It redrew maps, it changed trade, it reshaped everything. And it leaves us with this huge question, one that's as relevant today as it was then. When a city falls, when an empire dies, what is truly lost, and what is born from its ashes?
When you picture Rome, what comes to mind? The Colosseum, right? Caesars, legions, the powerful center of the world. But what if I told you there was this long stretch, for centuries, in the Middle Ages, where Rome was just chaos, so violent, so out of control that it was basically a city with no ruler? I'm talking about a place where its own leaders were practically prisoners, and the ancient monuments, yeah, those were private battlegrounds.
Listen to this. A monk, St. Bernard, writing back in the 12th century, said the Romans were a nation nursed in sedition, untractable and scorning to obey. Ouch. I mean, that really gets to the heart of the problem we're digging into, doesn't it? This fierce, we-do-what-we-want spirit made Rome a complete paradox of power. So how did it get that way? Well, it all starts with a simple problem. Rome didn't have one boss. It had two.
All right, so in the 12th century, you've got this city, Rome, being pulled in two different directions. You have the Holy Roman Emperor on one side and the Pope on the other. Both of them are claiming, "I'm the one in charge here," which, leads to a pretty obvious question. If two people think they're in charge, is anyone actually in charge? And this is where it gets kind of wild. You've got the Emperor, right? He has the military might, the real power, but he's almost never actually in Rome. Then you have the Pope. He lives there. He's a constant presence, but his authority is more about faith and tradition, not brute force. So you have one guy with all the muscle who's MIA, and another guy who's always around but can't really make anyone do anything. It's the perfect recipe for absolute chaos. So while the Emperor and the Pope are locked in this epic power struggle, a third player enters the game. And this one comes right up from the streets of Rome. It's the people themselves. They were just done being a pawn in this game. And all they needed was a spark. And that spark came from a pretty radical preacher. This preacher's name was Arnold of Brescia, and the idea he was pushing was so radical, so dangerous for the time, that they called it a political heresy. And yeah, it would eventually get him killed. So what was this earth-shattering idea? Simple. The church, he said, has zero business being in government. None. He believed that any priest or bishop holding land, titles, or political power was basically throwing away their shot at salvation.
So Arnold's message was, when you boil it down, incredibly simple but totally revolutionary. He said the sword and the scepter, the symbols of real-world earthly power, they belong to the government, to the people, not to the clergy. And for the Romans, who were already living among the ruins of their ancient republic, man, this was electrifying. They were inspired. They rose up and decided to bring the old republic back.
And for about 10 years, believe it or not, it actually worked. The Romans restored the Senate. They were governing themselves. But you can probably guess that the Pope and the Emperor were not happy about this. I mean, this was totally unacceptable to them. So Pope Adrian IV pulls out the big guns. He places the entire city under an interdict. That means every church is closed, no sacraments, no services. A huge spiritual blow. Then he teams up with the Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. They find their common enemy, Arnold, and, well, he's executed. And they throw his ashes in the river so no one could turn his grave into a shrine. And just like that, the new republic was crushed.
Okay, so the emperor is gone, the pope's authority is shaky, and the people's republic has been stamped out. You'd think maybe things would calm down? Nope, not even close. Rome descends into pure, unadulterated anarchy. The city is now run by these, well, gangster-like noble families who basically carve up the city into their own personal kingdoms.
And at the heart of this chaos was a feud between two major families, the Colonna and the Ursini. Think of them like the Hatfields or McCoys, but on a citywide, epic scale. The Colonna backed the emperor, and the Ursini backed the pope. And we're not talking about a little disagreement here. This was a bloody, all-out war that tore Rome apart for 250 years, a quarter of a millennium.
I want you to really picture this. These families turned Rome into a literal war zone. Those incredible ancient monuments you see today, the Colosseum, the tombs of Augustus and other emperors, they weren't tourist sites. They were seized and turned into fortified compounds, private fortresses. They'd build towers on top of them, fill them with soldiers, and basically use them as bases for their private wars.
It got so out of hand that in the 1250s, the city had to hire an outsider, a senator named Brancaleone, just to try and restore some kind of order. And what was his first major act? He went around demolishing all these illegal noble towers and fortresses. He tore down, get this, 140 of them. 140! That's how many private strongholds were choking the city. So, what about the popes, the supposed leaders of the city? Forget about it. They weren't revered figures. They were basically prisoners. The stories are just insane. One pope was literally grabbed by the throat in the middle of a church service. Another was dragged through the streets by his hair. Servants were blinded and paraded around on donkeys just to humiliate their master. One pope was even killed by a stone during a fight. Being pope in medieval Rome, it wasn't a holy office, it was a death trap.
So after centuries of this, just unrelenting violence and chaos, something had to give. The papacy finally hit its breaking point, and what they did next was one of the most dramatic, unthinkable decisions in the entire history of the church. They planned a great escape. You can just feel the sheer desperation in this one pope's confession. He's just been assaulted at the altar, and he basically says, you know what? Dealing with one powerful emperor is better than dealing with 20 of these Roman barons. He's saying he would rather have a single, distant tyrant than the constant up-close terror of these warring families.
And so, in the year 1309, they did it. They did the unthinkable. Pope Clement V and his entire court, they just left. They abandoned Rome. They packed up the whole shebang, the entire headquarters of the Catholic Church, and moved it from the Tiber River in Italy to the Rhone River in the much safer city of Avignon in France.
Now you'd think this would be it, right? The final nail in the coffin for Rome. The Pope is gone, the city is broke, it's overrun by gangs, it seems totally doomed. But, in one of history's great ironies, an idea that was born right before the popes left would end up making the city richer than it had ever been.
So right before the big move, Pope Boniface VIII came up with this absolutely brilliant idea. It was part spiritual, part economic genius. He called it the Jubilee. He declared the year 1300 a holy year. And here was the deal. If you were a pilgrim and you traveled all the way to Rome to visit its most important churches, you'd receive a plenary indulgence, which is basically a get-out-of-purgatory free card, complete forgiveness for all your sins.
And the response? It was absolutely staggering. An estimated 2 million people flooded into Rome for that first Jubilee. 2 million. In the year 1300, with no cars, no trains, no planes. Just think about that. And they're all pouring into a city that was so violent its own ruler had to flee for his life.
And the money they brought with them? Oh man, there's this amazing account from an eyewitness at the time. He said the offerings from the pilgrims were so huge that 2 priests had to stand at the altar of St. Paul's Basilica with rakes in their hands, not for collecting leaves, for raking in the piles of gold and silver coins. They couldn't even count it, was coming in so fast.
And this is the ultimate irony of the whole story. The city of Rome, which was so violent and ungovernable that it literally drove the Pope away, suddenly got super rich from an event invented by the Pope. An event that worked so well precisely because he wasn't there to cause political trouble. They figured out how to cash in on the idea of Holy Rome without having to deal with the messy reality of its actual ruler.
So it leaves you with this really fascinating question, right? In the end, what was more powerful? The chaotic, violent reality of Rome, a city with a ruler, or the powerful idea of Rome, the sacred heart of Christendom, a place where you could find salvation? For a long, long time, it seems like the idea was infinitely more valuable.
Let's picture Rome for a second, but not the Rome you're probably thinking of, not the Rome of emperors and legions. No, I want you to imagine a city of glorious ruins, but one that's just haunted by chaos. This is 14th century Rome, a lawless, leaderless city. And this is the story of one man, born to a humble family who tried to bring back the glory days all by himself. This single question, right here, was the obsession of Nicholas Rienzi. You have to understand, this was the son of an innkeeper and a washerwoman, but he spent his days absolutely buried in the writings of ancient Rome. He'd look at the magnificent ruins all around him, and then at the crime-ridden streets he lived in, and he was just consumed by this one burning question. Okay, so to really get why Rienzi was able to rise like he did, you first have to understand just how bad things were in Rome. The city was a total shadow of its former self. Really, it was like a failed state, teetering right on the edge of collapse. So what did this lawlessness actually look like on the ground? Well, for starters, the Pope, who was supposed to be the ruler of Rome, wasn't even there. He'd packed up and fled to Avignon in France, leaving this huge power vacuum. And in his place, the city was carved up by 2 warring noble families, the Colonna and the Ursini, who basically treated the streets like their own personal battlefield.
Life for the average Roman was, and I am not exaggerating, a nightmare. The nobles were arrogant, they were corrupt, crime was just everywhere, and justice? That was a distant memory. As one historian so grimly put it, the people were most deeply wounded in the dishonor of their wives and daughters. It was a city absolutely desperate for a savior.
And right into this chaos steps Rienzi. Now, he didn't have an army, he didn't have a noble title. What he had was a brilliant mind, a silver tongue, and a plan to seize power with maybe the most potent weapon of all, an idea. You know, Rienzi was a master of political theater. As a notary, he had a public platform and he used it. He would give these fiery speeches about Rome's ancient rights, and he even commissioned huge allegorical paintings to be put up in the streets, showing Rome as a suffering widow and the nobles as lions and dogs and serpents. He was waking the people up to their own misery. And then he made his move. On May 20th, 1347, after a secret meeting with about 100 co-conspirators, he staged this incredible procession. He was bareheaded, but in full armor, flanked by banners for liberty, justice, and peace, and he just marched on the Capitol. The nobles were so stunned by his audacity, they just fled. In a single day, without a real fight, the innkeeper's son was the master of Rome.
And his choice of title? It was a stroke of absolute genius. The people might have called him king or emperor, but he chose tribune. It was the perfect move. The tribune was the ancient protector of the common person, a title just dripping with symbolism and totally beloved by the people.
And the initial success of his rule, what he called the good estate, was, and I'm not kidding, nothing short of miraculous. He moved with lightning speed. He decreed that every single homicide would be punished with death, and it didn't matter how noble the person was. He tore down the private fortresses of the barons, he secured the highways, set up a city militia, and even created funds for the poor. It was swift, it was effective, and it was impartial justice. The result was completely transformative. I mean, literally overnight, Rome became safe. The historian Edward Gibbon wrote that the woods began to rejoice that they were no longer infested with robbers. Trade boomed, pilgrims started coming back, and for a moment, peace actually reigned. You have to picture this scene. It must have been just incredible. The most powerful men in Rome, the heads of the Colonna and Ursini families, were forced to stand, bareheaded, before the tribunal of the man they used to mock as a buffoon. They trembled and swore allegiance to his new government. But, and you knew there was a but coming, this is where the triumph begins to curdle into tragedy. It's a timeless story, isn't it? What happens when a revolutionary gets everything they wanted? At the absolute peak of his power, Rienzi's own character began to betray him. You can just see his ego starting to inflate in this new title he gave himself. Friend of mankind? It's a bit much, isn't it? His noble desire for fame started turning into this childish, showy vanity. The humility of the tribune was gone, replaced by the hubris that comes with absolute power. And the contrast with his supposed role models was just stark. The ancient tribunes, they walked the city on foot with a single attendant. Rienzi, on the other hand, rode a white horse, wore velvet robes embroidered with gold, and was surrounded by 50 guards and trumpeters playing on instruments of, get this, massy silver. He was starting to act exactly like the tyrants he'd replaced. His downfall was shockingly fast. In August, he throws this lavish and frankly profane festival. Soon after, he summons Europe's most powerful leaders as if they were his underlings. By December, he'd alienated everybody. When a tiny force entered the city, the people who once hailed him as a hero, they just stood by and did nothing as he fled. But the story isn't over. Not yet. After 7 years of exile, wandering Europe as a pilgrim, and even spending time as a prisoner of the Pope, Rienzi gets an absolutely astonishing second chance. See, in his absence, Rome had descended right back into chaos. The people, forgetting all his follies and remembering only that brief piece of the good estate, were clamoring for his return. And the Pope, always seeing an opportunity, sent Rienzi back to restore order, this time with the official title of senator. But the man who returned was not the same idealist. The first time around, he was the people's champion. Now, he was just an agent for the Pope in Avignon. The hope was all gone, replaced by the cynical distrust that was forged in exile. He was no longer a liberator. He was a tax collector, forced to impose cruel new policies just to pay for his power. And it all fell apart even faster this time. After just 4 months, a new salt tax proved to be the final straw. A mob, egged on by the nobles he'd once defeated, stormed the Capitol building. What happened next was one of history's most dramatic silences. Rienzi tried to give one of his famous speeches, but he was met with a volley of stones. They found him trying to escape, dragged him to the platform where he'd once passed judgment, and there, for a whole hour, he just stood there, silent, as the mob that once adored him stared in this mix of rage and lingering awe. Then a single assassin broke the spell. Rienzi's death marked the end of a really dramatic chapter, and you could say, the end of a certain kind of dream for the city of Rome. So, what is his legacy? Well, he proved that Rome could be governed and that the nobles were not invincible. But his dream of a restored Roman Republic, it died with him. And here's the final tragic irony. His failure created a power vacuum that only the popes could fill. He had, without meaning to, cleared the path for them to return and become the absolute monarchs of the city. Which leaves us with the central question of his life. Was he the last of the ancient Roman patriots? A man who loved his city's past so much that he was destroyed trying to recreate it? Or was he simply a man whose noble ideals were corrupted by vanity, becoming a tyrant in his own right? The answer, a lot like the man himself, remains a fascinating and ultimately tragic contradiction. You know, how does an empire that literally called itself eternal, one that built monuments to last forever, just fall apart? We usually think about the fall of Rome in terms of big battles and famous emperors, but what about the city itself? The actual stone, the marble, the buildings? Today, we're going to take a journey right into the heart of those ruins to figure out how a city can actually forget its own greatness. I mean, just listen to that haunting image from the great historian Edward Gibbon. He's not describing a city that was simply defeated. He's painting a picture of a colossal body, a giant that's been torn limb from limb. It's this physical destruction, this rubble you can touch, that tells one of the most powerful stories in all of history. So, yeah, that's the big question, right? It's not just about what happened, but how on earth it was allowed to happen. How does the very heart of an empire become a ghost of itself? Let's go find some answers. All right, so to start, we're not actually in ancient times. No, we're jumping forward, way forward to the year 1430. We're going to join a scholar named Paggius. He's sitting on top of the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and he's just looking out over this scene of total, utter desolation. He's not seeing the Rome of the Caesars. He's looking at its corpse. Wow, you can just feel the shock in his voice, can't you? For him, this wasn't some academic exercise. It was a deep, personal grief. He was witnessing the aftermath of a world-shattering catastrophe, centuries after it all went down. And just get a load of the details of this decay. This isn't some vague, oh, it was all ruined kind of thing. The Capitoline Hill, once considered the citadel of the entire world, is now just overgrown with thorns. The benches of the Roman Senate are literally buried under a dunghill. And the Roman Forum, the very center of civic life for the empire, it's now a pasture for pigs and buffalo. It is just a shocking picture of how far and how low the city had sunk. So, seeing all this, Edward Gibbon wasn't just going to sit there and lament like Paggius. No, he was a historian. He wanted a diagnosis. He asked a simple question. What forces, over 1,000 years, could possibly lead to such a complete and total collapse? And this is what he landed on. 4 main causes. First, you've got the slow, steady wear and tear of time and nature. Okay, that makes sense. Second, the famous attacks from outsiders, the barbarians and Christians. We've all heard those stories. But it's the last 2 that are the real kickers. The way the Romans themselves used and abused their own heritage and their own endless internal fighting. Now, to see how all these forces actually worked together, Gibbon does something brilliant. He basically performs an autopsy on a single iconic structure. A building that was, in so many ways, the very symbol of Rome itself, the Colosseum. Listen to this ancient proverb, recorded way back in the 8th century. It tells you everything. The Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was a prophecy carved in stone, tied directly to the fate of Rome and even the whole world. Its survival was basically a measuring stick for Rome's own permanence. And this timeline, man, it just lays out the whole tragic story. For centuries, the Colosseum was this revered icon. As late as 1332, it was still being used for grand spectacles. But then something changes dramatically. By the next century, it's treated as just a common quarry. Basically a free-for-all for anyone who needed building materials. Powerful families literally looted it to build their own palaces. It wasn't until the 1700s that the popes finally stepped in to try and save what was left. And let's just pause on that bull feast in 1332 for a second. It was like this echo of the past, a final gasp of Roman pageantry. The nobles rode into the arena with these incredibly dramatic, chivalrous mottos. It's such a poignant scene, this brief, spectacular festival happening inside a monument that was already well on its way to becoming a ruin. But of all of Gibbon's causes for the fall, maybe the most unbelievable one wasn't an invading army or a natural disaster. It was something internal. It was the deep, staggering indifference, and frankly, the ignorance of the Romans themselves about their own past. Even back in the 14th century, the great poet Petrarch was just baffled. He, a visitor, knew more about the history of Rome's monuments than the actual native Romans did. They were living among the greatest wonders of the world and had simply forgotten what they were. So instead of history, you know what they filled that void with? Superstition. They'd look at these incredible, lifelike statues on the Capitoline Hill, and they didn't see art or history. They saw something they called art magic. They made up these wild fantasies about how the statues were enchanted and had magic bells to warn the Senate. The true story of their own city was completely lost to them. And this ignorance wasn't harmless folklore. It had real, destructive consequences. Get this story. This magnificent 10-foot-tall statue of the hero Pompey the Great is discovered. It's found lying under a wall separating 2 properties. So what's the judge's brilliant solution? Saw it in half, so both property owners get a piece. It was only saved at the very last second by a cardinal who happened to hear about it. That's how little they valued their own priceless heritage. But here's the amazing thing. Out of this whole story of decay and forgetting, something incredible was actually born. The very same ruins that made the scholar Poggius so sad would, centuries later, spark the creation of one of the greatest works of history ever written. And that's given right there, in his own words. He's standing in the exact same spot as Poggius, looking out at the same devastation. But instead of just feeling despair, he felt inspiration. He decided right then and there to understand and explain the very ruin he was looking at. In a way, the decay of Rome gave birth to its most enduring story. Which really brings us to a final, pretty big thought. Every civilization eventually leaves ruins behind. Gibbon taught us how to read the story in Rome's, and it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? Centuries from now, when people are walking among the remnants of our world, what stories will our ruins tell about us?